Hey there, welcome back. In this segment, we're going to go over the basics of how to delete, add, or edit a mesh. I'm also going to introduce you to this bottom bar here, or at least just a few pieces of it. So to start with, let's delete this default cube. Select it, press X, and click Delete, as though you're Xing something out of existence. Now let's replace it with something more interesting. In order to add a new mesh to our scene, you can press Shift-A to bring up a menu. You can also find this menu right down here. This allows us to add all sorts of objects to our scene, but the only type we're interested in are the meshes, so hover over that category. Generally speaking, when you're going to make a new object, you'll pick a shape that looks the most similar to what you're trying to make as a starting point. For now, I just want to show you how a mesh works, so pick whatever interests you. Oh, but your object might not spawn at the center of the grid. That's because it uses the location of the 3D cursor as its creation point. So you can hit Ctrl-Z to undo, and then press Shift-C to shift the cursor to the exact center. This might not be the most important or exciting hotkey, but I think it's worth knowing. I also might pan my view a bit to make sure it's all nice and centered again. Once that's done, hit Shift-A again to add the mesh of your choice. So, right now, this gray object is in what Blender calls object mode. It's one solid shape, and if we move it around, then we're moving the shape as a whole. But with your new object selected, press Tab and it'll shift into edit mode. You can also use this menu down here, which has changed to reflect what mode we're in. We can't select any other objects in the scene, but we can edit the tiniest pieces of the one mesh we're focusing on. You may already know this if you're familiar with the world of 3D, but in case you don't, a mesh is comprised of three basic building blocks: vertices, edges, and faces. To put it simply, you have points, or vertices, that can be connected to form lines, or edges, which can in turn form the outline of a polygon, or face. The faces are what actually make your mesh visible by reflecting light. So, remember last time when we moved the cube around using that widget, or by pressing G, S, and R? We can do the exact same thing to vertices. Click on one of these points to select it, then hold down Shift to select a few more. Now try transforming the cluster, and you'll quickly see how you can edit the shape of a mesh. If you like using the widget, it's worth noting that you can change what type of transformation it's doing by clicking here. Personally, I never use any of the widgets beyond the default one, which I use all the time, but that's just my preference. Anyway, time for a few new hotkeys. You ready? First, there's A for all. If you have anything selected at all, A will deselect everything. If you have nothing selected whatsoever, A will select everything. This is a very handy hotkey, especially in edit mode. Next up, we have B for box select, which allows you to make a rectangular selection of vertices. Then there's C for circle select, which lets you click and drag to select more vertices. You can scroll to increase or decrease the size of the circle too. Both box and circle select act as though you're always holding down Shift, adding more vertices to your selection. With either of them, if you hold down the middle mouse button instead of the left mouse button, you can deselect. Finally, there's Z. In the last video I said that if you're transforming something and you press Z, it does things in respect to the Z axis. But if you just press Z all by itself, it does something completely different. It toggles you between solid and wireframe view. This is particularly useful in edit mode because it lets you see and select the vertices that are on the other side of the mesh. There's another way to do this by clicking this little icon down here, but I find it's often useful to have solid view block the vertices on the other side, so I've just gotten used to pressing Z when I want to see them, and Z again when I'm done. You can also switch which view mode you're in on this little menu here. Each view has its uses, but for now I'm just going to stick with solid and wireframe. Alright, let's get rid of this new mesh we've added. You don't want to do this in edit mode though. If you delete all the vertices while in edit mode, you're not actually deleting the mesh. You're just reducing it to a zero vertex mesh, and you'll still be trapped in the edit mode of this void you've created. The same actually goes for moving all the vertices as a whole, because the center point of the mesh stays glued to the same spot if you're not in object mode. That can be useful to take advantage of because it gives you creative control over how your object scales and rotates, but I can't tell you how much confusion I caused for myself when I was first starting out because I didn't understand the nuances of object mode and edit mode. So, making sure you tab into object mode first, go ahead and delete this mesh. You can Shift-C once again to make sure your cursor is centered, and finally use Shift-A to add yet another mesh. This time, we're just going to add in a cube, like the one we started with. Our goal is to turn this cube into a wedge of cheese, so I'm going to stretch it first by pressing S for scale and Y for scaling along the Y axis. Then I'll punch in 1.5 and hit enter, which will make it 50% longer than it was. At this point, I'd like to direct your attention towards a new UI element, this little magnet on the bottom bar. These two things basically determine our snapping settings for when we move, scale, or rotate anything. Make sure that this magnet is turned off and that the menu next to it is set to increment, which I believe is what they should be by default. This will mean that whenever you move something, you can hold down Control to get it to snap in increments based on this grid. So, with those settings set, press numpad 3 for side view. If you don't see this grid show up in the background, you're probably in perspective view, so press numpad 5 to switch to orthographic. Once you're ready, press G and Z, or grab the blue arrow so we're moving along the Z axis, and hold down Control so we're snapping in increments. I want to move the cube up so that the bottom of it is aligned with the X and Y axis, the red or green lines. I'd also like to make this a bit shorter, so I'm going to tab into edit mode and press A to deselect all the vertices. Then I'll press Z to go into wireframe view, allowing me to select vertices on the far side of the mesh. Next, B for box select, and select all the top vertices. Grab them on the Z axis, hold down Control, and drag them down by -0.5. You don't actually have to be super precise with this stuff. I'm just telling you the values I'm using so it's easy to follow along, but blocks of cheese can come in many heights and sizes, so do whatever looks right to you. Next, let's press Z to get back into solid view, and select just these two vertices at the front, on top. I'm going to use a new hotkey shortcut, Alt-M, for merge. Merge will basically combine two or more vertices into just one vertex. In this case, I want to merge these two together at the center between them. Then I'll repeat that process for the bottom two. This gives us our essential wedge shape. I think that's enough for this segment, so let's go over just one last thing, saving our work. As you'd expect, you can go to File, Save As, and choose your project's name and location. I would recommend at least creating a folder for your Blender projects, which you can do by clicking this folder button here, but how you organize everything is up to you. With that saved, we're done. If you had any trouble following along, I'll be providing a copy of my Blender file with each video, but I heavily recommend you try to recreate the project yourself instead. So to recap, we covered the basics of what a mesh is made of and how to do some simple edits to them, then we applied that knowledge to create a wedge. Next time, we'll start learning how to use modifiers, which will allow us to make holes in the block of cheese and make it look nice. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.